Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our conversation, The Forgotten Middle, How to Grow Mid-Level Leaders in an Overstretched World. Before we begin, our standard housekeeping, everyone is on mute and shall remain on mute for the duration of the session. However, we would love participation, so please drop any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. The session is being recorded, and we will send out a copy of the recording as well as the slides to all registrants within the next day or so. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Greg to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate, and appreciate everyone being here today. The topic's really timely. It's important because we know what mid-level leaders do for our organizations. They hold our organizations together. They're the glue. And we've known that over the past few years, there's been some challenges that have come up. In particular, they're asked to straddle strategy with the operations side to really, keep things moving forward for their organizations. But there hasn't been the same kind of investment in learning and development just because they've been so busy doing. And what happens then is, and what we're hearing from clients is, they're starting to see gaps in their succession plans. So they're coming to us and saying, we're feeling like our mid-level leaders are not ready in the time when we need them to be ready to take on heightened levels of responsibility. So that's really the topic of today: is how do you help mid-level leaders grow and learn and develop in the areas that are important to the organization, while at the same time they're dealing with this environment of these challenges and not having the kind of resources that they might typically have. So before we get started, let me introduce myself and my co-presenter for today. So my name is Greg Lescu. I'm an SVP in our leadership development space at LHH. I spend a good portion of my time working on designing and deploying leadership development programs across all levels, including mid-level leadership, which we're talking about today. I've been in talent management and development for over 20 years, and I work through a lot of different areas aside from leadership development, which is talent strategy, coaching, and executive assessments as well. For those who aren't familiar with LHH, LHH is a global talent solutions provider who really works across all phases of a talent lifecycle, right from the early days where people are recruiting and selecting, and they get developed into organizations, through team effectiveness and cultural solutions, all the way to outplacement services. With me today is Kelly Stevens-Perry. Kelly is with Amira, which is based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Kelly is the head of their learning and development area. She oversees their mid-level leadership program, and Kelly has some really interesting things they've done with their program that we thought would be beneficial for everyone to hear about today. Kelly's very experienced working with designing and rolling out learning programs and understands a lot of the best practices in creating learning momentum, especially at the mid-level. And she's also worked in a lot of global organizations, so she also understands and has a keen understanding, I would say, of the cultural differences that need to be taken into account when you're thinking about a leadership development program. For those who don't know Amira, Amira is an energy and services company that serves, I think, about 2.5 million customers across Canada, the US, and the Caribbean. One thing, and I think this is why it's great having Kelly here, is that Amira, in general, places a high degree of importance on developing their leaders. They invest the time, they invest the resources. They want to have a strong pipeline of talent to make sure they can overcome those business challenges that they know they'll be facing in the future. So we're going to hear a bit from Kelly later on. And as Kate was saying, as we go through this webinar, well, you'll be on mute. I'll be asking you a few times to put some comments or questions into the chat or the Q&A feature respectively. And so we'll cover those. We'll keep it as interactive as possible, even though we've got a lot of us on mute. So welcome everyone. So let's go through the agenda. There's 3 key items. We want to talk about the challenges faced by mid-level leaders to start with. I think it's helpful to get an understanding of the environment that they're in, because we can't just design a program for mid-level leaders in a vacuum. We have to take into account the kind of conditions that they're working in and what's being asked of them, and find the best ways to help to accelerate growth faced with those realities. Next, we'll look at some of the critical competencies for mid-level managers. This is really to give you an idea of it answers the question of grow towards what? What are we trying to grow towards? Each of you in your own organizations will likely have your own competencies for mid-level leaders that you'll say are critical for the success of that group and the organization. But we thought it would be helpful just to have a look at a little bit of the evolution, what's changed. So as you're going through your processes and you're starting to think about what are those leadership behaviors at the mid-level that we want to grow people towards, what are some of the other organizations doing on the basis of what's happening in the business environment these days. And then finally, we'll have a chat with Kelly. I'll ask her a few questions. We'll have open it up for the Q&A. We'll hear about Amira's mid-level program. We'll get right into some of the details of what's working, what needed to be tweaked, what's been most effective, just because, again, there might be some pieces from some of the things you hear today that you can use in your own programs. Okay, so those are our main things. So let's start with the challenges that are faced by mid-level leaders. And really, I think the 5 that I have here, you probably will recognize at least some of them in your own organizations. Working over capacity, not just for a period of time, but more systematically or chronically, is one of the big problems. So there really is a time scarcity out there. People just don't have time to put towards learning and development like they did in the past. Operating with limited resources, which means that and I think this is due to a lot of the M&A activity that's been going on, a lot of the post-pandemic situations of just having to run a lean operation puts a lot of additional stress, which means you think about a middle manager will have to run and do some admin tasks that perhaps they didn't have to do before, and then go and have a strategy meeting with senior leaders. And imagine what that would do to your kind of mental gymnastics you have to do to be able to deal with that dichotomy. Overused on and execute on a strategy has to do with the pressure that's placed on mid-level leaders in terms of the fact that they're so relied upon to ensure that things are running well, that the organizations are hitting their core priorities. Yet there's an awful lot on their shoulders. So it's a little bit around the resilient side of things. And then leading hybrid teams, which is really different for some organizations. For others, this is not a big thing. But for organizations that had typically been in office 5 days a week and now have at least some work from home, if not some resources working from home full time, others are in the office at least part or all the time. It's a different working atmosphere and requires different skills and a different ways of working from the mid-level leaders. And finally, navigating omnipresent changes, which is really like, in the past, it would be changes would come up. They would have time to, digest what's happening, think about the rationale of why this change is occurring, and look at putting a change management process into place. Those changes are coming in waves that are layered on top of each other now. And the changes tend to be more transformational in nature. So it's not just the types of changes, it's the magnitude of those changes and the frequency of them that is really vexing for people. I'd like, if you can, for those of you who can get into the chat, let me know what is not on the list that you're experiencing. I'll start with Kelly, just to share if there's anything at Amira that her mid-level leaders are experiencing in terms of challenges. But while she's doing that, please put some comments in the chat around what you are seeing with your mid-level leaders and the challenges they're facing. Kelly,
Thanks.
What's happening over in Amira?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. It's interesting because when I look down this list, I would say at Amira and across all of our operating companies, our mid-level leaders are certainly feeling the pressure in all of these areas. In particular, I would say with the change, because it's just happening all the time, small scale, large scale. But I think the other piece is just keeping up with technology. Our industry is not unique to many other different tech industries, for those that are on the line today. And technology, it's changing so much. So it's just, we're looking at those mid-level leaders to also add that to their plate, in addition to the things that we see here on the screen. So that's a big one. And then we're asking them also to work, with an agile mindset. And so that's been another, especially since the pandemic, that's been another area that, of focus that we're asking them to do. So it's a very, very full plate, that's for sure. And then expecting them to have that thought leadership in these roles, whether they're senior leaders or directors. So
yeah, it sounds very familiar, Kelly, to some of the things that we're hearing. It's kind of this, like, people's heads are down, right? They're not able to spend as much time thinking about what's coming around the bend and thinking about the strategy side, because there's just too much on their plate. Kate, just a quick technical side note, it looks like the chat is not enabled. If we could enable that. There was a comment in here, and thank you for that, Kelly.
Yeah, it's the Q&A. Sorry for the clarification. Put your questions in the Q&A. We don't have chat enabled, but we'll read the answers as they come through the Q&A.
Okay, perfect. And there were a couple comments in the Q&A. Someone said AI is huge. I think, Kelly, you talked about technology coming in. We're going to touch on AI in a little bit when we get into some of the critical behaviors and what the impact AI will likely have on what's going to be required of leaders. Pace of change absolutely is another comment from Steve. Staffing reductions, ineffective decision-making frameworks, 100%. One of the things we've heard a lot of, which is interesting, and I think when we get into the next one, it's the middle managers feeling like they're kind of stuck in the bureaucracy, is usually when there's some sort of a crisis. So we had the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and then now the pandemic. Is decision-making authority tends to roll higher in organizations. So middle managers now feel like, and a little bit of the risk aversion comes out, is the whole organization needs to go almost right to the top to make decisions where typically they would have been made lower down. So this tends to gum up the system a little bit, right? It makes things slower. It's harder for larger changes that are necessary to happen, and middle managers can feel frustrated by that. So I think decision-making frameworks, absolutely. There's a lot of desire these days to push decision-making authority back down into organizations and come up with more robust decision-making frameworks and make sure people know the sandbox in which they can play when it comes to making decisions. Another comment from Christiane, being a leader who also has to produce non-management duties, 100%. Frank, was budget pressures, expectations of younger workers? Yes. Many leaders having a reluctance at engaging their staff in difficult conversations to avoid turnover. This one is almost omnipresent, thinking about challenges, because I think it's difficult for leaders to do that. And it does impact, especially when we talk about from a career pathing and learning sense, that is an issue. I'll cover that in a little bit. Nikki was saying, working with leaders, clients who are faced with the same issues at the same time. So it's sort of that, the waves that are layered on top of each other of challenges they're having. Managers, Doreen has said, managers who are expecting different things from their managers. Employees want more of the manager's time, but managers, as you say, are working over capacity. So 100%. It's a little bit of like an access thing, even though we've got all this great technology to access leaders. If their calendars are full of critical things they need to get to, they're not exactly in a they might say we have an open door policy, but the reality is they don't. And so we do need to think about those things from a learning standpoint too. And Melissa had said retaining key talent in times of work changes is also big. So a lot of the issues we're seeing very common, and there's more to the ones that we're seeing here. So what's the result of all of this? A couple things are managers in some research that we did fairly recently cite organizational bureaucracy as their top frustration. So almost half. This goes back to, I think, in part to their ability or the amount of latitude that they have to make decisions, and they feel like they are stuck in a situation where they're being asked to do so much with so little. It's very difficult. The other part is around the percent of middle managers' time spent leading people. Who, one of the comments that was there, 25% leading people, yet the mid-level managers and the people they lead would say they need more time. It's just not enough. And really what their job is to make sure that they are delegating and pushing out some of those key decisions, but they're just not getting enough time with their people to be able to do that. However, what one could argue the flip side, that if they were more effective at using that time and being better leaders, they might be able to squeeze more value out of the time they do have with them. So there's a little bit of a catch-22 there. And then I think finally, nearly half of middle managers are reporting high burnout. A very difficult situation, because what it means is that emotions get frayed, decisions might get rushed. It starts to ebb away at some of the cultural priorities that an organization might have if they're middle managers who are really looked at to model the vision and values of the organization. If they're not able to do so because they're at the point of burnout, it's a big problem. The other part of this, the impact on learning and development, is that in the study that we did, leaders, being senior leaders, have this different viewpoint. They have a strong learning and growth mentality at that level, but managers, which would be managers and director level, so essentially the mid-level managers would be in this group in the middle, only 50% of them report having a strong learning and growth mentality. And the big rationale is they just don't have time. They're too busy doing, they're rewarded for doing, they're told to get things done and show results. There's not, part of their KPIs are not on how they're developing themselves, they're more on showing those results. And the same goes for non-managers. So it's a bit surprising, I think, but I think it's part of what we need to be thinking about when designing a program is, how do you get people to feel like learning isn't just another thing being added to their plate? Like, it's not one more thing they have to do, that's something they can get excited about. It will, affect their career in a positive way and get them engaged. That's part of the key in terms of the design of programs these days. So let's cut into talking about the competencies. So I'll do a quick little snapshot back into the recent past of what competencies would typically be developed at mid-level. We'll talk about the ones that were just after the pandemic, and then the future-facing ones that I think are important to think about. Again, each of you within your organization will need to think about what the leadership behaviors are that are most critical and relevant for you. And you'll probably see a lot of the ones that you'll recognize within your own program. I think the point here is to think about if there are other ones that have popped up, that it might be ones to consider. We would always recommend doing a needs analysis at the beginning to again answer that question, grow into what. And a needs analysis really should include the participants, the mid-level leaders and their leaders, to make sure that they feel like they've got some skin in the game. They've decided what they're going to be grown towards, because they're the ones closest to the business challenges. Okay, so first off, let's look at, this is pre-pandemic, so roughly 2015 up to 2020, the mid-level competency evolution had a top 10 of these competencies in there. You'll notice that a lot of them are kind of operational in nature and more results driven. So things like leading change, driving execution, building high performance teams, kind of what you probably would have seen even longer back in the early 2000s. But I think some of the other ones that are start to creep up were things like influencing, because organizations are getting flatter. And the two at the top, communication, decision making, tend to almost always be there when you're thinking about mid-level leaders. But they have evolved a little bit. we'll make these available just for those of you, if you're scribbling down notes, we can make the deck available for you afterwards. So no need to copy this down. Just after the pandemic, so a couple of the key changes. So again, you'll see decision-making, communication, but communicating with impact. The thinking is there's a lot of static out there nowadays. So when someone is communicating, it's not just about being, sharing a message that's logical and timely. It's more around making sure that people will remember it, and that it has some of those human factors in it, right? There's an emotional element with communication, so people will not only remember the message, but that they will be able to carry it forward and want to action it. Other ones that popped up are these the ones where you see like the humanistic ones, like leading with resiliency came up as new. Adaptability came in and adaptability and leading through ambiguity. There's some commonalities there, but these ones are certainly, with all the changes that are going on and the level of the pace of change and the level of details that people have in terms of when they make decisions, very difficult. So leading through ambiguity and being able to understand the situation, determine which data is available to make a decision on, and then push past risk aversion to make a call and move things ahead. That's really key now and in the future, is that leading through ambiguity. Enhancing collaboration and belonging. You'll see collaboration was on the list before, but now it's been enhanced or expanded to say it's not just about playing nice with people in other parts of the organization or outside of the organization and partnering well, but it's also about inclusion and making people feel like they belong to the organization. Back to those humanistic elements that we see that came up after the crisis of the pandemic. So these were really big ones. Building organizational talent, again, expanded on from building high performance teams, because it's the thought that you need to be able to find talent within the organization, not just building a team and bring people in from outside, but think about it more holistically. So there's a little bit of a change there. And then guiding transformation, which typically would be more of a senior level competency, but now a lot of that has been pushed down to mid-level leaders. And what this is it's really on large scale transformations. It's how do you make sure that people can navigate through it in the best way possible with the least amount of adverse impact, and to make sure that you're boosting people's resiliency along the way, and so that they can absorb and digest those kinds of changes. So let's have a look at what are the potential mid-level leader competencies for the future. And you'll see some of the similar ones that are popping up here. So adaptability. These, by the way, are not necessarily in an order, even though it looks like a top 10. It's just a grouping of 10. But adaptability is there. The connecting, this would be an evolution of the communication one, which is the communicating with empathy. So using strong active listening skills, making sure that people feel heard and that they are a part of planning moving forward. Innovation is there, which is really around taking calculated risks. This is a fairly large one. It tends to be a little bit difficult because it is an innate trait. Is that part about having the taking risks and being willing to try things and potentially fail, which is a part of innovation, but doing that in a way where people feel inspired, that it's a safe place to do things, that you draw up a map of what that would look like to innovate and learn from those innovations and move forward. So this is another competency that has come into the fray. We've talked about influencing, collaboration as well. But there are some ones in here that I'm going to highlight that someone mentioned AI is huge, and it certainly is. There are some competencies that we know in the next 2 to 5 years will come more to the forefront because of the introduction of AI into the workplace. So the ones that are highlighted have been tagged as the ones that will likely be linked to bringing generative AI into the workplace, along with business acumen and judgment. The thinking is that as any new technology that comes in, This one is going to be different though, because it will absolutely change the way people work, and thus it will absolutely change the way that leaders need to interface with people. So making sure that people are heard, and you're starting to think about, where can we use this to provide the best value for the organization? Because right now it is really scattershot. It's still out there, and there's a little bit of a fear of missing out when it comes to utilizing AI. So people are sometimes diving in and then having to roll back what they're doing. That's quite normal. But I think using business acumen and judgment to decide when is there something where you can gain a competitive advantage or realize efficiencies or increase productivity because of AI, and what impact it might have on people. And then how do you interact with people or help them, lead them as they're interacting with AI? It cuts into some of these other ones around the change. And I'd say one, energizing the organization is also a new one, which is really around the inspirational leadership. Still back in that, we'll call it the humanistic category, but it's more around getting people to understand how they themselves connect with the organization and think about like that they are working on something that's bigger than the sum of all the parts. And this has to do with enhancing their engagement and making them feel like the organization they're in is the one for them, really. So as a retention driver. So that's a little bit around some of the competencies that we've seen and some of the evolution. But you can see just in general, to sum all of that up, is that it really is the humanistic elements that we see moving forward. Even as technology comes in, those will become more and more important. That the idea of the self-regulation and the resiliency is really huge these days, to be able to create safe spaces for people to talk, to be able to help people get through situations they're finding themselves in. And for middle managers, it's really around the emotional intelligence side of keeping their emotions in check and helping to do the same with those around them.
Hey, Greg, before we move on from the competencies, we do have a question that I wanted to bring up about determining the competencies that are most relevant to your specific organization. Do you find that these change across organizations and industries? Are they pretty flat? Like, what does that look like in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thank you, Kate, for pointing that out. So there are ones that I'd say are kind of the ticket to the show for mid-level leaders. So you're most times going to see things like influencing, because organizations are getting flatter and they're more, it's how you navigate and work within a matrix is more important. So in the past, it used to be more hierarchical. You could lead through authority. Now it's more, how do I get things done with peers or people in the organization that I don't necessarily have authority over? I need to convince them that it's the right thing to do when they are also as busy as they are. So that one, decision making, strategy, these are ones that you would almost always see at the mid-level. There's usually something around the driving execution part, which is in this one it's not showing, but there's almost always some sort of a something around getting stuff done or being results driven. And how you get to some of those to figure out what's right for your organization is really to conduct a needs analysis. So basically, it's to try and figure out what the challenges are now and in the future. So you're trying to be sort of present and future facing to say, what are those challenges, and to drive them into leadership behaviors so that you can say, we can pick our top 8 or 10 ones that we know are most critical on the basis of some of those interviews you might do with mid-level leaders, their leaders, and senior leaders in the organization. So there's a number of ways of doing that, but that's generally it. I think where this can be helpful is just to say, if you know that the humanistic ones are going to be more important later on, that needs analysis can be massaged a little bit. You can kind of say, what didn't come up with some of these things that we're seeing and hearing as we look at our company or our sector, and you can put those into your list of competencies. But essentially, that's the way to do it, is to pull that information from within the organization in collaboration with your senior leaders. And then what it will do, especially for the participants who might go through a program like that, if they know that this came from senior leaders and from themselves, they had input into it, they're much more likely to rally around and say, yeah, this is worth my time to develop in these areas. Okay, great question. Okay, so that was a bit about the competencies. Now, let's talk a little bit about the elements of mid-level leadership development program, because when we talked a little bit about the challenges we'd see, we talked about, what are some of those competencies that are critical to organizations for now and for the future. And then we also have to think about how do these mesh with the learning preferences of mid-level leaders so that we can make them feel like it's not something that's being added to their plate, that this is something they can get excited about. What I thought we could do is have a look through the lens with this discussion of the 70-20-10 learning model, which for those who aren't familiar with this, it's basically a model that underscores the optimal sources of learning and shows how they're typically utilized as a percent. Please don't take this as you should be 10% in the learning event or you should be 20% here. It really doesn't work that way. And I think even the people who back in, I think it was in the 70s when they came up with this, they had no intention of having it into those blocks. But it is helpful to think about each of these sections, which is the structured learning, learning from others, and learning from experience, because your program should be borrowing or at least cross-pollinating some of the elements from each of these. And the reason is mid-level leaders tend to have a pretty diverse set of learning preferences. I was asked once a while ago about, and I think there was a comment earlier about younger people, like younger learners coming in, who might be mid-level leaders, but they're on the younger side. So we know that there's going to be a lot of Gen Zs coming in to the organizations fairly soon and taking up more space in that area. But realistically, learning preferences are not necessarily linked to generations. So, for example, as a Gen Xer myself, I like learning online and through technology. Whereas you might think as you get older, you might still want the old school methods of being in a classroom with people for days on end. And there are some younger people who do value that. So I think the idea is more to say, instead of thinking about it through generations, think about it through having a host of learning preferences. Not to say you should have everything that's on this slide available in your program, but you should probably be injecting parts of it from each of these just to make sure that you are addressing different people's learning preferences. Okay, so please take the 70-20-10 as with a grain of salt. So I want to touch on a few of these elements. I won't go through each one of these, but what I'd like to do is to highlight the ones that we think, because of the nature of the environment that people are in, we like to call it like in-flow learning. Like, is there a way to build a program where a lot of the learning happens while people are like working alongside their regular responsibilities? And so that in-flow learning, it fits into their busy schedules in a way that's the least disruptive for them or provides high value. So things that are concise, punchy, have different ways of accessing learning, a little bit of group and a little bit of individual. So things like that are what I'm talking about. So from the structured learning side, back in the day, it used to be all about doing workshops that were full day or even multi-day. I remember, I don't want to date myself, but I would take literally almost a week off to go and do learning, which just does not happen anymore. And there's not anything wrong with if your organization does have things where you have multi-day learning, that's okay, as long as it's not being perceived as this is killing us, I'm not looking forward to it. It really should be situated in a way where it will work and you're taking into account the participants' experience. So you think about web workshops rather, where they used to be a day long or multi-day. Workshops now are usually somewhere in the range of 2 to 2.5 hours thereabouts. We have done, especially if they're virtual, better to be on the lighter side because it does drain people's attention a lot more when they are virtual. Although what we have found is a lot of times a mix of virtual and in person sometimes bookending a program with, they have an in-person opportunity where they're already getting together and you can kick off the program, then largely virtual to save on travel costs and money, and perhaps a capstone at the end where you're also doing that in person to make sure that the sustainability is there. These are things to think about when it comes to how you do those workshops. We have found when we've reduced workshops to around 90 minutes or so, that the feedback we get is they want more, so participants want more soak time, they want more discussion time, they want to be able to be with their peers for a bit longer to cover some of the content and talk about its applicability within the organization. So generally we're in that 2 to 2.5 hour range. When we're doing things virtual, 3 hours is more normal, or maybe a little bit less, sometimes 2.5 to 3, we're doing it live. Other things like where they used to have, you would take a course, you'd have an entire book you'd have to read as a pre-read for a course. Now everything should be really more bite-sized and concise. So any of the learning resources that are available, and especially if they're delivered in a multitude of ways where you can access it through a learning portal or get actual hard copies, has to be concise and punchy, because we know that that's what mid-level leaders are asking for. From the learning momentum side, or the learning from others rather, there's a much greater demand for coaching these days, because it's so, and especially to have coaching intertwined with structured learning. The advent and the introduction of virtual coaching has meant that where mid-level leaders who may be the high potentials of that level of an organization used to get access to coaching, it's now become a lot more budget friendly, we'll say, to provide coaching across a mid-level leader level within an organization. Often we'll have program designs that have shorter workshops. We'll sometimes have one-to-one coaching that's a part of that, where they can play off each other. You have a little bit of some group learning, you've got some one-to-one learning, and then sometimes we'll also break that into smaller group coaching sessions to talk about how things were applied back on the job. And this again addresses that variety of learning preferences that people have. They do want to learn, they want to spend time with their peers, they want it to be shorter, but they also want that the individual and highly relevant 100% individualized learning, which you get through one-to-one coaching. So this one has come up quite a bit. I'll circle back to the feedback element in learning from others in a minute. I want to touch on the learning from experience side. So in the learning from experience, I think the learning really has to be practical and immediately applied back on the job, where it used to be at times there would be placements or special projects or sometimes field assignments that maybe didn't feel as relevant, or they didn't see the connection to their career path. I think now they want to make sure that any time that's spent there is something that is going to really add value to them. I think one of the things I want to talk about that's in this section and loops back to the feedback area is around the participants' managers' involvement in the program, just how critical that is across any of these elements. So I believe the statistics are something that's close to 80% of development priorities are not met if the manager is not supporting it to at least some degree. And so what that means is they have to be involved in any program that you put together. When we think about workplace integration of learning, that back on the job or experiential learning, there's also statistics that would show that where people have rated organizations lower in engagement surveys on things like career pathing and development, the mere act of their leader pointing out the activities that they are doing that is developing them and it is enhancing their experience and thus getting them ready for what's next in their career, whatever that may be, just by pointing that out, it bumps up their score by around 15% or so in terms of engagement in that particular area. So a lot of times we'll encourage managers to say, look, you can't just let people go. You can't open the barn doors and let them run out and do their thing. You have to be involved. You have to be thinking about where they want to go with their career, what they're doing now and how they are developing along a path, and point those out, because it's a really simple way. I think someone said earlier, it is tough to have those conversations. And it is true, but I think, when you think about how are you going to develop people in a way that is in flow, that is a great example where it's not adding anything to the time requirement. It's really just a little bit of a different focus from their manager onto the participants that are going through. The second one, and I want to circle back on the feedback component, is, and this one is always a weak spot for organizations in general. So managers of participants you go through generally have a tough time providing feedback. Sometimes what we'll do is actually do a feedback workshop, or have do some group coaching on feedback itself, because it's such a critical element. As people are going through and learning these things and trying them, their leader has the best visibility into how they're doing, and can be one of those developmental buddies who can say, look, here, I'm going to reinforce things that you've done well by sharing that feedback and the results. Or if there's constructive feedback they can give to say, here's what I observed. What do you think might have gone differently if you tried a different approach? And provide that feedback to them can be invaluable. So sometimes, even through a program for mid-level leaders, it's good to think about that next level up. What do we need to give to the VPs to make sure that they are also in a spot where they can support this program and make sure it's going to be successful? Okay. So to wrap up this section, it's around bite-sized, concise, highly relevant, a mix of individual and group learning. These are some of those elements that are really cherished by mid-level leaders. So I'm going to switch over, and we'll talk to Kelly about what they're doing at Amira's mid-level leadership program. And because Kelly, again, has a great sense of both how to pull together these different elements in a way that will resonate with that level of group, but also just how do you adjust, because no program rolls out and is exactly as planned. There's always little course corrections that need to be done along the way. So that's why I think it would be great to hear from you, Kelly. So thank you again for joining. And maybe if we take a step back from the actual elements themselves, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the importance of accelerating the development of mid-level leaders at Amira. So what spawned the program from the beginning?
Thanks, Greg. And thanks for having me. You just spoke about getting sponsorship and support from the participants' leader. So if we go back, we were focusing and facilitating to hundreds of new people leaders for a couple of years. That's where our focus was. We're like, okay, we need some consistency as it relates to those that have never managed people before. We need to give them the fundamental tools to be able to manage people. And so what we found was that as the program continued to grow and was successful, we had those participants coming back and saying to the facilitators and to myself, saying, Kelly, this program is really great. But when I go and meet with my leader, so that's the mid-level, when I go to meet with my leader, they're not familiar with, these models and this coaching framework that I'm talking about. And it would be great if we could offer training for them. So that was one of our aha moments. And also, to your point a moment ago, it's so important just to arm the next level. With the skill sets and the mindset. So that's what really sparked it originally. We knew that we had a really big opportunity across our operating companies to say, okay, for these senior managers, directors, when was the last time we, in the flow of work, we pulled them out of their business to give them the time and allow them to focus on their development? And in our case, it had been quite a while. Sometimes when you get to that level, it's like, okay, well, we've got them there. We've done a good job. So that's really what's put the fire under us to work with you and build a new program.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. There's a question that was online, is how are managers selected to participate in Amira's program? Are they selected through interviews?
Good question. So quite often now that we have our mid-level program running effectively, we've been running it now for 2 years. So the selection process hasn't, well, at the beginning we had to catch up. So what I mean by that is we wanted to baseline our directors in as many operating companies as we could. We're still working on that. But really we want to offer the program early on when they move into that mid-level leader role. So ideally, the first 3 to 12 months in role, we see that as an opportunity to bring them in. So we work with the HR business partners, we work with the senior leaders across the operations, and that's how we determine who goes into that program. And it has timing as well sometimes for some of these senior leaders. As you talked about earlier as well, Greg, just in terms of the demands on this level. So we also validate with the participant, is this the right time? Perhaps 3 or 4 months later is better, but we do stress that, you've got to carve out that time and talk about, what's the WIFM, what's in it for them, and that that the learning is actually going to help them, give them the skills and the mindset to do things easier. So yeah,
Absolutely. And I've heard from organizations as well that it's good to be ready to provide ad hoc options if something, a need pops up, but also to have programmatic options that are available. So a little bit of, the reactive, but also the proactive side of things.
Yeah, and that is happening to us now. We have one of our operations. They don't, so they want to hone in on leadership development for this year, mid-level and up, but they don't necessarily have the time and or the budget to put them through a full program. So we're taking, when I have an opportunity to show you in a few minutes, we take parts sometimes of these larger programs, and we offer them individually. So that's the beauty of some of these programs. They can stand alone and still be effective, although we do prefer for folks to go through the full path.
Got it. Kelly, what I might do is lift up the hood so we can have a look at the mid-level leader program at Emera, and maybe you could talk about how the design of the program addressed some of those mid-level challenges that we showcased earlier, knowing that people are time starved, that they want a variety of learning approaches. Maybe you could just walk us through a few of the elements here.
Terrific. So, one of our goals, because we do have operations in the U.S. and the Caribbean, in addition to Nova Scotia, it was an important criteria for us to be able to build global cohorts. So the learning map that you're seeing illustrates a path that can be delivered just as effectively live virtual over Zoom or in a classroom setting. So we designed this deliberately to be delivered live virtual prior to the pandemic. And part of that reason was to build a community of mid-level leaders, regardless of where they sat in the business, regardless of what operation they were in. You'll also, I'll point out the orange circles on the map. That represents what Greg referred to a few moments ago as the bite-sized learning. So we've taken what this really is, a 4-month program, and we've broken it into 2.5-hour modules. Whether it's in the classroom, live, or it's over Zoom, they're 2.5 hours. And where the experiential learning and the 70% and the 20% come into play within this program is prior to coming to a live virtual or live event, a learning event, there's approximately 30 minutes of digital pre-work. And then after the module, we've staggered these modules approximately 3.5 weeks apart, so that each participant, each mid-level leader has an opportunity to then practice on the job what they learned in the module. So it is very much demonstrating a 70-20-10 approach. It's reinforcing the importance of a bite-sized learning. And the modules that we specifically chose that are illustrated here on this learning map, this was 2 years ago. And these specific modules came out of a needs assessment, and also came out of a need for consistency. So you heard me mention earlier that we have a program for new leaders. So even though we do offer some new content in this path, we also wanted some consistency in terms of knowledge. So we offer coaching at all levels in terms of our leadership growth. But for the mid-level leader, we upped it. And it's like, how do you not only coach to your managers, but how do you set the bar and demonstrate strong coaching skills or coaching through that change? And it's how to take those skills and implement them more broadly on an operational level. The unique part of this program that differs from other leadership programs that we offer is that this program offers the participants, the mid-level leader, one-on-one coaching. So the facilitator is also a certified professional coach. So the facilitator has built a really great relationship with the participants. And after they've gone through the learning, we insert 3 one-hour one-on-one coaching sessions into this program. And it gives the leader an opportunity to discuss one-on-one the unique challenges that they have within their operation and their business, and how to take this learning and apply it into their scenario. And, I would say that is really one of the golden nuggets of this program. And we get very good feedback on the one-on-one coaching.
That's great. And I think the coaching is designed, while it can be complementary to the topics, it takes that purist coaching approach though, right? Where if someone says, I want to use our time together with this professional coach to talk about something totally different than what's here, they're allowed to do that, right? That's, I think, a part of the design.
It is. And where the group coaching comes into play is you'll see the triangles on the screen. That represents the group coaching scenario. So you're right, Greg, they do have the opportunity to have that personalized time. And then they have the chance to talk about with their cohort, what's going well, how are they applying those skills, what are some of the demands and the challenges in their business, and they're able to learn together as a group.
Gotcha. And I'll ask one last question, Kelly. I'll turn it over to the group. If you've got some questions for Kelly or myself, just put them into the Q&A, as we've got about 6 minutes left. Any program design needs to be tweaked along the way, sometimes either from what participants are looking for or just how things roll out. And I think what you've heard, I think you hearkened back to the 70-20-10 and that inflow learning. We get asked a lot around like, how much spacing do you leave between these? Because you don't want to leave too much and lose momentum on a program, yet you can't keep them too condensed, because then it does start to interfere with a person's regular schedule. So anything that you could share with the group of like lessons learned or things that you tried, didn't work, and then did this and it worked better the next time, what might you share?
Two main things. So this is our year 3 of this program. And I would say, number one, the biggest aha was originally when we rolled it out, we were offering the one-on-one coaching sessions as 30 minutes. And it was clear that that was not enough time, in particular for a leader at this level, to have that one-on-one time. So we, as an organization, put some additional investment to offer then the 1 hour coaching. Then in terms of, separating these modules, also learned that anything more than 3 weeks, they start to lose the momentum in terms of tying the learning back and knitting all these modules together. So I say maximum 3 weeks between modules, minimum 2. So really 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. That's really the sweet spot in with this program. Yeah,
that's great. And I think those familiar with coaching will know 30 minutes is, you can touch on a very specific topic in that time. It's a little tight, but 45 minutes to an hour, you can actually, really do a deeper dive into that particular area. So that makes perfect sense. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A section. So what has been the qualitative participant feedback on the design or delivery of the program? This question from Melissa.
So I think the biggest feedback was some of the more positive feedback, and it's not always what we'd expected, was giving the leaders thanked us for, like, it's fantastic that we finally have the opportunity to come together as a cohort. I think at this mid-level leadership level, it can be a lonely place. And we have a lot of leaders that come in and say, you know what, I feel now I have a community, whether it's inside their own company. We run company-based emerging leader programs, or globally. So now they have a community of thought leadership together. I think that's one of the big ones, and a forum for them to come together and learn. That would be a big one. I'm just mindful of time, Greg. So
yeah, got it. And that makes perfect sense. And I think it's what we hear a lot too, is the opportunity to connect and build allyship and
yes.
Being able to learn from each other, because especially at this level, there's a good amount of experience in the room. So having discussions where you can draw from other people and do that beyond the confines of the program. I think you'd set up a communication channel for
yes.
each of the groups, right? Either through Slack or another technology, so they can connect with each other. Is that right?
Yeah. So, one of the biggest challenges with this program, no different than any other leadership program, I think, as we all know, is how to avoid the one and done. So how do you ensure that the learning's sticking? So this year we've introduced some retention activities, and one being each graduating class, or all graduates actually, of this program are now on an MS Teams channel. And we're now pushing through email bite-sized learning bites for graduates, going back to even 2 years ago, to keep that learning alive. And some of our operations have even gone so far as to ask me to bring the facilitator back. And we have the facilitator coming back now, a year and a half later, and we're doing our high-level refresh and some accountability discussions around what are we doing now to keep this learning embedded into their everyday work.
Yeah, perfect. I think we've got time for one last question. Susan is asking, what size audience did you find most effective?
So my rule of thumb is always a minimum of 12, but for this particular group, because of the richness of the dialogue with these senior leaders, I don't recommend going past 18. 16 is a sweet spot.
Yeah, that's good to know. And I think that's, it's, they would say there's an economic thing there where you want to get as many people through in a cohort, yet you also want to make sure that the program's going to meet its objectives. There's enough time to discuss and people won't get lost in the size of the group. And usually that 12 to 16 size is somewhere around the best. Perfect. Well, that brings us to the end of our webinar time. I want to thank Kelly for being here and for sharing all the information with us. Hopefully all of you have had a chance to kind of immerse yourself in this topic, and even if you get 1 or 2 nuggets from this that you can use back within your own organizations, I think that's a win for today. So we appreciate your kind attention, and hope to speak with you again soon.
Thanks, Greg.